Okay, question 11. This is a inheritance question. It's going to require us to do some genetic crosses. We're given this information. We'll highlight a few key points from here. So first things first, we look at this. It says that Marfan syndrome is a rare genetic condition of the body's connective tissues, results in person being tall. So it's going to tell us about the symptoms of the disease. First question that's not irrelevant. Children with the condition usually inherit from one of the parent. This is the important bit. It is caused by a dominant allele M, not the recessive allele lowercase m. The question then tells us is a homozygous recessive male meets with a heterozygous female. Use a genetic diagram to show the parental genotypes, gametes, possible genotypes and phenotypes of the offspring. And that's why it's 4 marks. We're going to give it 4 things. Genotypes, the parents, the gametes they could produce, and then the possible genotypes and therefore phenotypes of the offspring. So let's look at the information we've got. Well, to begin with, we're told that a homozygous recessive male. So what is his genotype? Well, if he's homozygous, recessive, homozygous meaning 2, recessive, the father is going to be homozygous recessive, 2 lowercase. The mother, we're told, is heterozygous, which means she has 1 of each allele. So she's going to have 1 capital M, 1 lowercase m. That is her genotype. The gametes that the father can possibly produce, well, he can only, when they split apart, produce a gamete with an M or an M. The mother, on the other hand, could produce an egg that either contains a capital, a dominant allele, or a lowercase one. There is a difference between the gametes she can produce. If we're going to work out the potential offspring genotypes from these parental gametes, we're going to do as the question's asked us and use a genetic diagram. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the father's gametes up here. Doesn't really matter which way around you do that. We're going to put the mother's over here. Remember, she produces either a dominant or recessive allele in her egg. And then we've done many times before, we're just going to combine these alleles to work out the possible genotypes of the offspring. Okay, those are the possible genotypes the offspring could be. For the phenotypes, well, the way I would highlight this, I would draw a nice ring around these. What is the phenotype? If they have a capital M and a lowercase m, the heterozygous, they've got 1 dominant allele. If they've got the dominant allele, it's going to be expressed. So these two would have Marfan syndrome. These two, however, don't have a dominant allele. If they don't have it, they can't be expressed. The recessive allele is expressed in the absence of the dominant allele. Recessive allele just leads to normal condition. So the phenotypes would be 50% Marfan's, 50% normal. There's your 4 marks. Okay, please get into the habit of doing these kind of questions right. Next question, part of this. A person wanted to find out if he had Marfan syndrome. He asked his doctor for advice. Use the information about the symptoms of Marfan syndrome to explain why it's difficult for the doctor to decide if he has the condition. Well, if we just go back and remind ourselves just quickly what the symptoms of the condition are. It results in a person being tall with abnormally long, slender limbs. Fingers and toes. It may also affect the heart and the eyes. The kind of reason why it's very hard for a doctor to recognise it is that those symptoms, apart from the heart and the eyes ones we described, wouldn't necessarily be obvious, okay? So the symptoms of the disease are not obvious. We could say, person may be tall or slim due to other genes, or family history, or just the way they are, okay? Just because you are tall or slim does not mean you have Marfan syndrome. So, suggest what other information the doctor could use to decide if the person has that. Well, two things you could say. Firstly, you'd probably take a look at the person's family history. By that we mean, is there anyone in his sort of closely related family that's had it? If there is, if they've been diagnosed with it, there's an increased likelihood that they would probably have Marfan syndrome themselves. You could also analyse or sequence their DNA. Obviously that's more expensive and time consuming to take the DNA and sample it, but we know the genetic mutation that leads to Marfan's. We've isolated the allele, it tells us that in the question, so we could look to see if they have that dominant allele in their genes, because if they have it, we know that they will have Marfan syndrome. Or lastly, you could look to see if they have other symptoms, either heart and eye symptoms, in combination with long limbs, etc. So if one person is just a bit tall and lanky, it's unlikely they've probably got Marfan syndrome. If they've got all the kind of characteristic symptoms of Marfan's, well then it's increasing likelihood, and then it would probably warrant one of the other investigations talked about there to find out. Last one there, it says many genetic disorders are caused by recessive allele rather than a dominant allele. Explain how examining a family pedigree could enable you to tell if a condition was caused by a recessive allele. Well, again, I'll put the answer first and then we'll sort of explore what we mean by that answer. The most obvious way to see a family tree if there was a recessive disorder is that if parents produce a child with the genetic disorder, but, a big but there, neither of them have the disorder themselves. What we mean by that is they're producing a child, neither of them has it. We could say that it skips, what that happens is it skips a generation. Disease, if it sort of appears in one generation, then it's not there again, and then 3 generations later it's present again, it's just lying. And that's because anyone that is able to produce a child without having disease themselves, they are carriers of the recessive allele. They have it, but it's either in conjunction with a dominant allele, they're heterozygotes. But obviously because they have a dominant allele, they don't have the disease. Let's just illustrate that quickly. Okay, if we imagine a family tree that looks like this, I'll just do a very quick one. We'll just sort of have a little key here. Okay, so we'll have our key over here. That is unaffected female. That is an unaffected they have, let's say, 6 children. Of those 6 children, they have 4 boys and 2 girls. 2 of those children are affected with the disease. So we'll just do that another key here. That's going to be an affected female. That's going to be an affected male. 2 of them had the disease, but neither of their parents had it. Well, straight away we can see then that these, we know it's a homozygous disorder because they both, we know it's a recessive disorder, so we know that both of these, whatever the disease might be, let's use T, must have 2 copies of the recessive allele in order to have the recessive trait. The only way in which they could have inherited two recessive alleles is that if each of their parents had a recessive allele, but because neither of the parents actually have the disease themselves, they're unaffected, we know they must both be heterozygote. If a disease is caused by a dominant allele, one of the parents must be sufferer from that disease, who then goes on to have a child, because they must have at least one copy of the dominant allele, which could be inherited. So if it's a dominant disorder, basically if there are offspring with the disorder, if the parents, neither of them have it, it must be recessive. If one of them has it, we don't actually know, it could be recessive, it could be dominant. But if neither parent has a disease, but they can produce children with it, then it must be a recessive disorder.